I am thrilled to be here, just because what you all are doing in practice, focusing on details, is a spiritual truth of our country.
You know, we can be Democrats and Republicans, but most Americans are patriots.
For over a decade now, good ideas have emanated from the BPC.
Thank you for convening this very impressive group of thought leaders.
Your organization has brought together leaders from across our society to advocate for common sense solutions to our most challenging problems.
Because if it's bipartisan, it's much more likely to pass.
When you have people philosophically and ideologically in two different worlds, and they put them together on a committee, that committee usually is not very productive. Once we get staffs blending, and John and I, they know that the members are friends and we talk, things can happen.
Thank you, Anand, for that introduction, and to the BPC for its important efforts.
Thank the Bipartisan Policy Center. You guys are great.
We all have bipartisan responsibilities to this nation, to defend principles that have long made America the beacon of hope.
It's going to take all of us to try to turn down the temperature and really focus on what unites us.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's event, Tech Policy on the Horizon, Plans for the 118th Congress. My name is Tom Romanoff. I'm the director of the Technology Policy Project here at BPC. And I'm pleased to be joined today by our esteemed moderator, Politico's Rebecca Kern, who will be taking over the mic in just a second. Our panel of experts includes myself, but also Katie Harbaugh, who's a fellow with the Democracy Project here at BPC, and John Sharushin, who's the Senior Associate Director for Business and Technology. So if you're joining us today, it means that you're interested in what Congress has in store for its technology agenda in the 118th session. Originally, BBC was tracking several possible outcomes for the latest election, and experts have concluded beforehand that the House may flip to Republican control and the Senate would be too close to call, but remain in Democrats' control. As of today, predictions seem likely. These predictions seem likely, but we don't know for several weeks. In terms of what we do know is that the margins of control are going to be razor thin, and bipartisanship remains one of the best paths forward. So today we're going to be talking about how technology policy topics that we identified in 117th look in 118th. These include things like content moderation, cybersecurity, cryptocurrency, antitrust, and artificial intelligence. I encourage you to submit questions using our comment function. We also have hashtag BPC Live, but I want to pass the mic off to our wonderful and knowledgeable moderator, Ms. Rebecca Kern.
Thanks for having me. I am excited about this session, and we're, in just a few days after the midterms, but obviously, as Tom referred to, we don't have all the results. It looks like we're going to be having probably a Republican-controlled House, but the Senate we're still waiting on those results. So I just wanted to do a quick round with everyone to ask what some of your biggest takeaways and maybe some of the biggest surprises were from election night, and maybe to put the tech lens on it, how you thought the tech companies, the big social media platforms, did on handling some misinfo and disinfo around the election, if you felt it was better handled than in the past in 2016 and 2020. So just a quick round of everyone just giving their quick thoughts there, and then we'll dig into some of the priorities we think will happen next Congress. I don't know who wants to jump in first. I know Katie's been going on panel back to back on talking about election results. So if you want to start us off.
Yeah, I'd be happy to start us off. I think that for me, but I'm really, in terms of how the tech companies have done, I think the jury is still out, right? I think we have to remember that, even after 2020, things went through January 6th and all that. And so continuing to watch, particularly with how that impacted the layoffs, might impact some of this, as some of these races are still being counted and we have the Georgia runoff yet happening. The companies have done a tremendous job, particularly around foreign interference. I think there have been some questions around their handling around things such as misinformation, but in all honesty, I think some of that is even disagreements of where these companies draw the lines on misinformation, and also some questions. They weren't as labeling as aggressively as they did in 2020 around people that were denying that the 2020 election was valid or not. And so I don't think we yet know, what, if any, impact that had. But I guess the final thing that I would say, there was a lot of different ways that campaigns were using the internet this time around, particularly a lot of advertising going to streaming, that I want to dig into a bit more and really see about. A lot more people were getting their information from TikTok. So there's a lot of stuff to still dig into. The last thing I would just say, though, is that I do want to caution us about getting complacent coming out of this midterms. It's fantastic that so far, knock on wood, things have not necessarily been worst case scenario in terms of violence or anything. But if Trump announces next week, we're going to go right into 2024. And I think it's going to be really important that we stay diligent.
That's very true. That's something on our calendars for next week. So any other quick kind of takeaways, Tom or John, you want to weigh in on the election?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. I think a lot of the experts, like I mentioned beforehand, who are making some predictions as to where things would go, initially thought there would be this red tide that swept across Congress and Senate, and that wasn't necessarily the case. We're still, again, waiting to hear back from a number of different tight races, and there's some takeaways there that the margins are going to be very thin when it comes to where legislation can pass. So hopefully that means that folks on both sides of the aisle will have to talk to each other. And in terms of the lead up to the elections this time around, I thought it was particularly noteworthy, with Elon Musk coming in and kind of taking over Twitter and having some issues there, kind of thrust that as a public space and some of the areas there that it intersects with our elections, but also with Russia outright admitting that they interfere with our elections, and that not necessarily being the big story that it would have been 5-6 years ago, but rather just like we know. And that it was surprising that that wasn't taken up. I would be surprised if that's not something that gets addressed in the next Congress, though. And in terms of the technology agenda, I think what we're tracking basically remains the same. We're still on track to say the House is going to go Republican, Senate potentially Democrat. We kind of expected that split democracy or split House, and so we have some ideas of what that might look like in bipartisan opportunities as well.
Yeah.
And if I get a chance, I'll sort of look into sort of like the tech agenda at a very macro level given this. So I think the election was closer than people expected. It looks like we're going towards divided government. So the big question is divided government going to mean gridlock or bipartisanship? And I think that's going to be decided on a issue by issue basis. Tech policy has traditionally not been as polarized as other areas, though I think certain issues in tech have become very polarized. So those might be areas where we see gridlock and maybe more action through like congressional hearings and things along that nature. But in other areas, we might see room for bipartisanship when issue isn't as polarized. So that's high level kind of where I think or how I think the election might affect tech policy at a very macro level.
Yeah. No, great. And I think we could just dive in. Since we know likely that the GOP will take the House, I want to see what you guys think, what Democrats might be pushing through in the lame duck, because if they will likely lose power in a few months, do you foresee any bills having a renewed momentum? I'm thinking a federal privacy bill, ADPPA, or any of the antitrust bills. Do you think this will give one last push effort or not?
I think no. I think Klobuchar will try. Like they will try, but there's so many other things that I think that they have to worry about. And I think both parties are going to get so enthralled in leadership debates and other things that I just don't know if this rises to the top. Plus, remember with the Georgia election, I think they're gonna want to stay focused on the issues that helped each party, win in this election. And tech was never really necessarily high on that agenda. So I'm not seeing it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll add, and I'll add to, in terms of Klobuchar's bill, and there was recently a push by the White House to say, hey, this exists, we support it, maybe it'll be happening in a lame duck. But to Katie's point, I think there's a lot of other priorities. The NDAA still needs to be pushed through, some budget stuff, and a number of negotiations as to what leadership looks like on committees. So I think that probably will take precedent on the lame duck session. You never know, though. For the Privacy Act, we're tracking that potentially that won't get pushed through in the lame duck and not reintroduced. But you never know. I'm not a tea leaf reader.
I'll give my take. So I basically agree with Tom and Katie on the antitrust stuff. I think there'll be another push for a couple of the bills in the space, but I don't think it's likely, though. Things can come together. Another area where I think there might be a push is crypto. I think, and we'll probably get into this a bit more. There have been recent events in the crypto space, especially around FTX, which might push Congress to try to do something right now. Now, whether they'll be able to do something in the lame duck session, again, I don't think that's very likely, but there is some push given recent events to focus a bit more on that issue.
Right. I mean, one area we referred to, content moderation, is a big issue for Republicans, and a lot of the leaders were expecting to take the spot of House Energy and Commerce, Kathy McMorris Rogers, and Jim Jordan likely to take Judiciary. They've all been pushing this, theory that tech companies censor conservative viewpoints. So do you foresee actual movement on Section 230 changes next Congress under a Republican-led House? If this, and then, do you foresee the Senate taking up the issue if there isn't Republican leadership per se there? in the majority?
Well, I can jump in, and Katie's kind of our expert on content moderation, so I'm sure she'll have a lot to add to that. But in terms of what is a stated agenda by the Republicans, there's the commitment to America, where, if you look at Part 3, there's a future that's free agenda, where they said that their priorities will be to confront big tech and advance free speech. So a lot of that has to do with Section 230, and there's a number of areas where they want to carve out specific regulations for big tech versus small tech to try to not kind of create a kitchen sink type legislation approach. But at the end of the day, when it comes to what Congress does, I think they're going to be responding a lot to what the Supreme Court decides on the Gonzalez case, Gonzalez versus Google, and the Twitter versus, I always say this name wrong, Tamanna, I think it is. I butchered that name and I apologize. But Congress is going to be responding to that potentially, and what's coming through from the states, Texas, Florida specifically, to what they're doing. So if Congress doesn't take leadership on this, Supreme Court potentially will, and we'll be kind of chasing what impacts that has on our internet long term. But there is a lot of bills that I think were bipartisan last time around that could be reintroduced around content moderation, looking at this transparency question, which Katie can speak to a lot more intelligently than I can on some of these things. But this idea to address conservative bias through increased transparency, holding these platforms accountable for their decisions through sunlight, essentially, and looking at the algorithms and things like algorithms that they use to promote certain stories as well. But I do think it's going to be a priority for the Republican agenda, more so than, say, antitrust was. And it does fit within the narrative of addressing what their constituents see as bias in big tech. So you did see it on the campaign trail, and I do think that it will be a priority on the 118th.
Yeah, if I can jump in, I think that I think there will be a lot of hearings on it. I don't particularly expect bills to actually get passed, so I think there'll be a lot of talk there. I too am also keeping a very close eye on the Supreme Court. I'm also keeping a close eye on the state legislatures, because we could see more bills trying to pass that maybe folks think that would make it through the courts and things of that nature. And I could see where we get into a world where, while there might not be any legislation for the next Congress, that by 2025, they get pinched enough between all the different state bills, things happening in the courts, as well as what's happening in Europe, that they might finally be forced to act. But that'll be a Congress 2 years from now.
Right. Yeah. We'll have to wait and see. Yeah. And one area of bipartisanship that John has referred to is crypto. And there's a lot happening in this space. I have been inundated with Musk news this week. So can you catch me up personally on the Binance FTX drama and how Congress may weigh in next year with legislating in the crypto space?
Sure. So let's start with FTX, and I can give maybe broader context to how Congress has been approaching crypto and what might happen next term. So for those of you who don't know, FTX is one of the world's largest crypto exchanges. They've gotten into issues recently around liquidity. So earlier this week, or even prior over the weekend, Binance, which is actually the largest crypto company out there, or crypto exchange out there, announced that it was selling a lot of the tokens that FTX, the tokens were called FTTs. Binance owned those tokens and was selling a lot of them, and that caused a major decline in the price of that token specifically. On Tuesday, it seemed like FTX was facing some major liquidity challenges, and there was an announcement made that by FTX that Binance was acquiring them, and there was a letter of intent for this acquisition to go through. Binance backs out the next day, says we're not going to go through with it, and a letter of intent, as I understand it, it's not binding, so they were within their rights of doing that. And a lot of questions are now being raised as to why FTX has been facing these problems, what exactly is causing it, what the next steps are. and what should be done to prevent something like this happening, in the future. A few just general caveats. Right now, there's many theories as to what's happening at FTX and why they ran into this issue. A lot of these are right now speculation. So there's reports out there that are trying to piece things together, but it's still unclear what's going to happen. And I predict that both the regulatory agencies and Congress are going to look into this both in the US and internationally. So I think that's a major area that the crypto world has been very focused on, because FTX also was seen as one of the more, unlikely to have an issue like this happen to them of the exchanges, and yet this happened. The speed at which it happened was incredibly fast. Pretty much everyone I know in the crypto space was surprised to see how this went down and the speed by which it went down. That brings me to crypto more broadly, and maybe we can get into this a bit more in later questions. But Congress has been focusing on the crypto space over the last year or so, with several major and minor bills being introduced. Senators Lummis and Gillibrand had a very large bill that they introduced early in the year, trying to tackle a lot of issues in the crypto space. That bill was followed up by a bill by Senators Stabenow and Bozeman, who are the chair and ranking member of the Agriculture Committee, taking a very broad approach as well. And then there were a bunch of minor bills tackling smaller parts of the crypto puzzle, taking it more piece by piece. So that was going on, and there was bipartisan debate and different alliances being formed in that space, and nothing seemed likely to, or at least of the major bills, nothing seemed likely to pass this year. The FTX issues that we saw recently will likely bring crypto to the top of people's mind in the financial regulation space, again, if it already wasn't so. Going forward, there's a question as to how much the issues with FTX are going to further push this issue into the next Congress. Then also, if projections are correct, there's likely to be a shift in power from the Democrats to Republicans in the House, which will change the chair of the House Financial Services Committee. The person most likely to be the chair next is a gentleman, Representative Patrick McHenry, who's shown a lot of interest in crypto issues. He is a believer in the potential for crypto, and he's put in place he's been working on a lot of policies in this space to try to balance different, criteria from, ensuring you sort of like protect people from harm and risk, or minimize harm and risk, while still promoting innovation in the space and reducing undue regulatory burden. So he's going to be pretty active in this space. He's more on the friendly side for crypto. He's more of a proponent of crypto relative to your average member. So I think we will see more action on in the next Congress. The question, though, will be, will there be a deal to be cut? How close are the parties together? And sometimes the issue isn't necessarily Democrat, Republican. Sometimes it depends on the committee of jurisdiction and just different factions within the different parties that sort of fall in ways that are hard to see from the outside. So just summarizing the main point, a lot has been going on in crypto. The recent news with FTX, I think, is going to bring it even further to the forefront. And in the next Congress, I think crypto will remain a major issue.
Yeah, well, thanks for that update. I wanted to also remind listeners that if you want to submit questions, you can use the live chat on YouTube or Facebook, which we'll talk about these companies too, and also Twitter using the hashtag BPC Live. We're getting a few questions, so I'll address them later. But I wanted to get back to the theme of bipartisanship and where we might see some other action. Potentially, we're saying crypto. What about Tom, do you think there'll be a reintroduction of a federal privacy bill next year? And do you think there's appetite for Republicans to still work with Democrats if they have the gavel in the House?
I do think that there is an appetite there to work across the aisle. whether or not the ADPPA gets reintroduced, I think still needs to be worked out. It was a three corners bill, meaning that the committees that have jurisdiction over it all had some sort of agreement. And then you had California Democrats at the state legislature have some concerns or issues there, and it didn't get passed. Bloomberg says that it's probably not going to get reintroduced. But what is likely to come from that is this idea of ensuring that children online have data privacy protections. And it is a strong path forward when it comes to bipartisanship. There are several bills dealing with children's data online and privacy. Kids Online Safety Act being one of them, and the Children and Teens Online Privacy Act. And when you think about a Republican-held House, you've got CMR, who's very passionate about children's privacy, who will be taking lead at that committee. And you also have this conversation happening on the other side with the Biden administration, where they put out some recommendations around content moderation, which was seemingly a different topic. But in those recommendations, they said they want to reform Section 230. They also want to protect children's data online and what happens online. So there's strong bipartisan support for some legislation around children's privacy online. And, again, as Kathleen McMorris-Rodgers takes over to energy, there's some indication she's put out there from a recent interview that she is very interested in creating a national standard and giving greater control, that gives greater control over data, especially for children who are under the ages of 17. And, there's this general debate right now in data privacy, which is this idea of right of action being one of them, whether you can sue. She said that she's okay with a narrow right of action on things, and the preemption, which is whether the federal law takes precedence over state laws. That's still under contention. California Dems are going to have something to say about it because data privacy impacts one of their main industries in the Silicon Valley, the tech industry. So CMR is indicated she's interested. The Biden administration has all indicated that they're interested. Democrats have, both in the Senate and the House, has said that they're interested. So there's a path forward with children's privacy. Now, a more comprehensive national data privacy law to be determined. There's some indications that the executive branch through FTC or FCC might stand up some regulations around it that will likely cause the Republican-held House to have some issues with kind of a federal agency-led address of this issue. And then you have diffusion of regulations from other countries. So very, very shortly, you're going to see that the United States and how we interact online, we're not in the driver's seat anymore. European Union is starting to do their own data privacy regulations, which could have a diffusion effect. California as well is coming up with their own privacy laws, which could diffuse to other states. And so you're seeing this very complex issue starting to come to a head. We were very close last Congress. There is potential for that momentum to carry through with children's privacy online. And there is stated interest from all sides of the party on that front.
I guess a question I'd have, though, is some advocates say individuals say if you move forward just with privacy, you're going to miss the opportunity to get a federal bill together. And I mean, I think some people think there's just really one shot, and ADPPA did include updates to COPPA. So it included children's privacy provisions that CMR did support. So do you think breaking off kids' privacy will then be to the detriment of eventually passing a federal bill?
Well, I think something is better than nothing. I do think that a national law is needed for data privacy to create a standard by which the tech platforms can, create a standard of care of sorts. And I was excited to see, and I was supportive, BBC was supportive of the bill last term. There was some indications that Republican leadership was not happy with the overcompromise or the compromise that was made around right to action and preemption, which could indicate that they weren't too happy with the bill as a whole. And so, not being able to push through something big, which I, again, think is needed and would support 100%, the next best thing is to try to protect children who are online more and more, especially after COVID.
Right. And we do have an audience question asking, like, is there an opportunity in the lame duck to push forward, do you think, the Kids Online Safety Act, which was the bipartisan bill in the Senate from Blumenthal and Blackburn, and it was generated from actually last year's hearings with Frances Haugen, the former whistleblower from Facebook, who discussed all these concerns with kids' safety and exposure to inappropriate content related to dieting and health, particularly directed at teenage girls on the platform. So do you think that, there could be an opportunity, lame duck, to add it onto an omnibus or a larger must-pass bill? It did pass out of Senate Commerce Committee.
Yeah. From the lame duck priorities that we've heard, has not come up. That isn't to say that it wouldn't get tacked on because of some of the support that it's had, and it's considered kind of a home run across the board. We haven't been tracking it in the omnibus and in the lame duck, but we've seen bills like this kind of that are widely supported also get pushed in as kind of a last minute a win for folks. And I will say that what you just mentioned in terms of the case study, there's other ways to get a bite at that apple when it comes to, for example, you mentioned teen girls and the algorithm that was, or the research that came out that it was detriment to their health and causing depression and even suicide among that demographic. I think that there is going to be a path there with the Supreme Court decisions when they're looking at recommendation algorithms that came out, whether that's liable. And so there's a number of ways to kind of address some of the negative externalities that have popped up around these things, whether it's through a data privacy specific act. I'm not sure.
Right.
So long-winded way of saying maybe.
TBD. Yeah. Well, and we do see California continue to lead in the privacy space. They have their own state privacy law that's more or less kind of the default law of the land, and they're updating it. Also, they did pass a kids safety bill too, the age appropriate design code, which is modeled after a UK law. So I think both you, Tommy, and Katie are tracking state efforts to regulate tech as well. In the absence of a likely federal bill, it doesn't sound like, we will get one this next Congress, maybe. But in the absence of it, where do you think states are going to be heading on privacy and kids' privacy?
Yeah, I think that it'll definitely be on the docket. I think the question will be, and I need to dig into a bit more of where some of the state legislatures net it out, and if they'll end up focusing more on content regulation versus some of them more on privacy. I think it will be a mix. You also do have some states too, even around advertising, like in Washington State, there's been a lot with Facebook around political advertising there. And they actually fined Meta $24 million, I think it was, here recently on some of that. And so I do expect to see some more popping up, but I think the major question is going to be, for which of those state legislatures are they willing to prioritize that over other things that they have? And I just don't have a great sense on that yet.
Right.
So there's a couple of things that we're tracking on that. Colorado Privacy Act, which goes into effect in 23, will have an impact on how data privacy happens. There's also the Connecticut's Personal Data Privacy and Online Monitoring Act, again in 23. You have Virginia starting to look at Consumer Data Privacy Act, which includes some provisions there. Utah is going to be again in 23. So it looks like 23 is going to be a big year for state level privacy acts. And then you have California, which we've already mentioned, who's coming out with these things. I do want to mention that, where there is a kind of a federal when we talk about data privacy, we're talking a lot of times about generic data privacy. There's also other paths around like how law enforcement uses data and some of the issues around that, biometric data being collected or the use of data brokers to purchase information on individuals by law enforcement. That's also a data privacy issue that's getting some traction right now, both in Congress and at the state level. We have been tracking that, but it's important that, not to add a little bit more dynamics to this, because the federal data law is very important. There's also these kind of use cases based laws like law enforcement, healthcare, things like that that are continuously in motion, which makes it so difficult. But at the law enforcement side of things, we're tracking a couple of state level data privacy measures as well as Congress, which there has been some indication of bipartisan support at the congressional level, especially around kind of the use of data brokers to purchase information without a warrant, and also facial recognition technology, the biometric data question.
Right. Yeah, so maybe potentially more narrow pathways on specific issues. But another area I wanted to bring up again is antitrust, and there was a lot of bipartisan movement this Congress, and it's all probably going to sadly fall apart by the end of the term unless there is a last Hail Mary effort in lame duck. So I can't see Klobuchar wanting to give this up. I foresee a reintroduction of it, but wanted to see, John, if you could provide any predictions on where you see if there'll continue to be bipartisan efforts to update our decades-old antitrust laws to make it easier to break up large tech companies and hold them to account easier.
Sure. So on antitrust, a big thing that's fascinated me over the last year or stuff is how there's both bipartisan support for many of these reforms and bipartisan opposition to many of these reforms. I like to say in the factions within the political parties, you see divisions on, people being on the opposite side. So the Freedom Caucus, you have people who support and oppose a lot of these reforms. And in the Progressive Caucus, you see people who support and oppose these reforms. So it's pretty fascinating from a political standpoint how the party lines aren't as drawn out. And even within the factions of the different, parties, the lines aren't as clear cut. So I think that's a fascinating thing that I've noticed over the years. So antitrust really kicked off, I think, a couple years ago when the House did a investigation into the practice of some of the large digital platforms and put out a report arguing that there's an issue there, and they made recommendations on certain remedies for it, and that those obviously were all debated with both critics and supporters of both the main report by the Antitrust Committee and then the report by the Republicans, which was critical of many of the practices of the digital platforms. It also was critical of some of the proposals put out by the majority Democrats. So that's a bit of a history and background on it. I think digitization, so just again, you mentioned antitrust laws were written 100 years ago, prior to, computers and, smartphones being a thing. So one of the debates right now is, whether antitrust laws are adequately suited for the digital economy that we have right now. With some people arguing that law, if it's, applied accurately, it addresses any problems, and even there's disputes as to what is a problem, what isn't a problem, what the issues are. So some think existing laws are fine. They either need to be just applied differently or just fine as is. Others think that the laws need to be changed quite a bit with, a variety of remedies being proposed out there. And even in terms of remedies, just to give some people some context, there's questions on whether the large digital platforms have engaged in anti-competitive merger and acquisition activity. So if the large tech companies acquired companies for the purposes of stifling competition and innovation versus, say, using the technology to make a better product and competing more rigorously. So mergers and acquisitions has been an area people have talked about. Online practices, at least that's how I call how I think about it. have been brought into question. So these are ideas like self-preferencing. So think of a search engine or a online marketplace, or some a smartphone that may prioritize its own products over, say, competitor products. If that's a major issue in this space, and if it should be remedied, if so, how? That's the second area, is online practice, and the third area is what's called portability, interoperability. But this is really sort of how data can be moved from a platform to another platform, or how platforms communicate with each other. Just to give an example to make it a bit more concrete, portability would sort of be the idea of maybe moving your information from your social media account to your smartphone. That's been another question as to whether making it easier to move data may invigorate or promote more competition in the space by making it easier for people to switch. So that's large context, or sort of where the debate is, what it was. In the next Congress, I think we will see some people trying to push for it. But if the House goes Republican, I think the projected chair of the Judiciary Committee probably will not want to focus on antitrust and has other priorities, and is a bit skeptical of what's going on. Though on the Republican side, there are certain members like Ken Buck who actually seem to be very vigorously pushing for stronger antitrust. So I think if the Republicans take the House, probably antitrust goes off the agenda. But given the splits within the different parties, there is a possibility. And just to add one more thing, I think I'm over my time, but one more quick thing. Current events often drive things into the news and cause Congress to act. Same with election cycles. So there's a lot of things that could happen that might drive antitrust back on the agenda. So it's hard to tell. I think unlikely that much happens in the next Congress if we have a Republican House. But again, things are always unclear.
Yeah, no, that's a good. I did speak with Ken Buck recently, and he's obviously going to be pushing for it, but he recognizes, if Jim Jordan runs the committee, he would have to work through him to get that moving, and Jim Jordan has not been the biggest advocate for it. Where Jim Jordan has been very vocal is the alleged censorship of conservatives on the platforms. And since Katie is our resident former Facebooker, I thought you could speak to that. I mean, obviously the platforms deny this. In fact, a lot of conservative posts are some of the most engaged and interactive with content on these platforms, and particularly Facebook. So do you still think that will be a talking point? One of our listeners also asked that question. I think it will be. But also, do you think the debate on Section 230 will get more nuanced? And do you think there could be any bipartisan pathway forward? We've seen the PACT Act been introduced multiple Congresses now, in the Senate from Thune and Schatz, pushing for more tech transparency as a means to get more information on what content's taken down, and then provide pathways for individuals to appeal. Like, is that a middle ground approach?
Well, I think that there's definitely going to continue to be a lot of questions around how the platforms handle conservatives, whether there's shadow banning or not. What I oftentimes tell people when we think about this debate, we really need to understand that I think where this question really is dancing around is where these companies decide to draw their lines on what is or is not allowed on their platform. And I would personally prefer a lot more conversation on that front and the types of things they do allow or don't allow. And I would love to see that debate between some of the Republican and Democratic members of Congress. But I definitely expect that to be a large topic of hearings. But I don't necessarily think that will be any legislation that does get passed. I think that's going to be more of a messaging type thing that they do. I do hope that there could be movement for the transparency for the PATA stuff. I do think that is a really good way forward for us to better understand what is happening on these platforms. But the other thing we have to mention too that I think is going to be talked a lot about is TikTok in China. Senator Rubio and and Representative Mark Gallagher from my hometown of Green Bay have an op-ed in the Washington Post today talking about how the United States should ban TikTok. You have FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr, who's been calling for that as well. And so I expect there to be a lot of attention and a lot of hearings also focused on that. And then I don't know how much this will get congressional attention, but there's a lot of other platforms that are getting attention that we've seen content going to. You've got, not only Truth Social that the president's on, former president's on, Parler, Gitter, but then also up and coming ones like Discord, Twitch, and others that may also start to get attention. And one thing that we could end up having is if you have a Democratic Senate and a Republican House, you could have a Democratic Senate focusing maybe on doing some hearings and pulling in the execs from those right-leaning platforms. And then you have Jim Jordan and those in the House talking more on censorship. So you could actually end up having some very interesting debates between the two chambers.
That's interesting. Yeah, just bringing in different sides of the platform space, and each chamber maybe focusing on one, but not maybe both.
And I'm also wondering, when does Musk testify?
Well, that was going to be another question. Yeah. So do you guys, obviously, if someone has not followed any news cycle, Elon Musk bought Twitter for $44 billion about 2 weeks ago today, actually 2 weeks ago. And dramatic changes have ensued. He's laid off half the staff. The top cyber and privacy executives apparently left last night. And now we're seeing an influx of a lot of fake impersonator accounts because he's now allowed individuals to pay for verification, more or less pay for a monthly service, and then you'll get a blue check mark, which was not previously their way of verifying individuals. So a lot more people will have blue check marks. I'm curious, he has always been calling himself kind of a free speech evangelist. So do you think he will be welcomed with open arms by Republicans in the House, and then be drawn in by Democrats for an influx of maybe some hate speech and misinformation on the platform?
I think Republicans would be mistaken to think that Musk is going to be always on their side on these topics. We've already seen them get upset by him doing those meetings with some of the civil rights leaders last week. And I can't believe it's only been 2 weeks and it feels like an eons ago with that. And so, but I do think, he's generally been trending in a direction that they like. And I wouldn't be surprised if potentially is he brought in as more of rather than having to answer questions and be held accountable, is he brought in by the right to try to push more of that free speech standard and be an example of a CEO who does that? I don't know, but I certainly expect for him to be visiting various parts of our government, from the FCC to the House, to the White House, very, very soon.
FTC has put out a statement today.
Sorry, FTC, not FCC.
Yeah.
Forgive me. Yeah.
Right, saying that he may be violating the consent privacy decree that Twitter is under.
Well, and that's what the staffers were saying when they left, right, this morning, is that they are concerned about that. And for folks who may not know about this, but Twitter entered into an agreement with the FTC around a series of steps that they will take to help increase the amount of privacy and security for your data and the things that they are doing. And there are very specific steps that they have to follow when they are launching new products. And let me tell you, it usually takes more than a week, like some of these products have been. So part of the reason those staffers left and what they wrote on their internal Slack was a concern that Elon was just ignoring those requirements by the FTC. And I believe there's a January audit as well that's coming in. But the FTC is no, nobody's above the law. And because he's doing all this out in the open, now they're watching it. And I expect a big increase in the number of whistleblower complaints and other things that people might be filing.
Right. Do you foresee an FTC taking action? I mean, they don't proactively put out statements regularly. So this was a pretty big deal today that they're calling out concerns. And we did see Mudge, of also former head of security at Twitter, came forward as a whistleblower, also making similar allegations that they are not following the FTC consent decree. So do you think that will be on Twitter's plate next year too?
Oh, 100%. I mean, I think we're entering a whole new world, and Lisa Khan will be looking for different ways to, for her own legacy at the agency. And then that can also turn into political infighting, right? Depending upon like if Republicans do still feel that Musk is sort of a favorite son, if you will, or favoring, I could see some people creating that into a political firestorm as well. And maybe you'll end up having Khan having to testify or something like that. I mean, it could become a real circus. But yeah, Musk is going to realize very quickly that these things are not to be messed with, and he's not above the law, and it's all just a matter of time.
We've seen FTC go back after other platforms for privacy violations, YouTube, Facebook. I mean, maybe not the fines that you think would make a big impact, but there's still, these legal court orders are worth tracking. And since we still have a, democratically run administration and executive branch, as you said, FTC's chair, Lina Khan, certainly could act. And I guess another question, just to segue into, both Tom and Katie referred to the Supreme Court taking up Gonzalez v. Google, which will bring Section 230, tech's big liability law, under the crosshairs of Supreme Court. And we know Justice Clarence Thomas has asked, it's written in multiple opinions that he wants these platforms to be held accountable and to be treated more like a common carrier. I don't know if you think the common carrier debate will come forth from an opinion here, but just kind of seeing how you think the Supreme Court will weigh in on Section 230 at this term.
Tom, do you want to take that?
Sure. So for folks that don't have the background, there's two cases right now in front of the Supreme Court that deal with narrowing the liability protections that Section 230 has. One is the Gonzalez versus Google, which specifically looks at, there was an unfortunate event where a young woman was killed in 2015 after an ISIS attack in Paris. It turned out that those attackers had been radicalized through their viewership of ISIS recruitment materials on YouTube and other platforms. It's not clear if it's just YouTube, but YouTube was the one that provided some recommendations. And mind you, this was in 2015, so this is a very different YouTube than today. But then they were, had an algorithm where if you expressed an interest in one thing, it would show you another thing. And other court cases have shown that Section 230 doesn't apply to a platform if it's a feature of the platform, not the language and the user content that's posted, but a feature of the platform that caused the harm. And in this case, it was the recommendation that radicalized and then led to the attack, which unfortunately resulted in the death of this young woman. And so by limiting that liability, the Gonzalez Google case says that, there is no protections of features on these platforms in Section 230. But if you take a step back, Google itself is a recommendation platform. When you go online and you type something in, it's recommending content. And so there's a huge impact there that could happen. And then there's the other case, the Twitter versus Tamana, and I butchered that name again. I apologize. I will remember it. But again, it happened with a content moderation conversation where Twitter had videos of ISIS, and as a result, potentially became in violation of the American Terrorist Act, where Twitter was seen as hosting these videos, which is a in-kind kind of support for the platform and supporting the group there. So if in that case there is a identified terrorist group that is got content featured on a platform, does that mean that that platform is liable under the American Terrorist Act for liability there? So the question there is whether or not that we have content moderation tools in place that can tag that kind of thing. And content moderation for the internet is hard. There's not really very good algorithms out there that says, this says it's, about ponies, but it's actually about ISIS, right? It takes a lot of coding background or a lot of advanced coding to try to catch.
Right, in particular video platforms, right?
Particularly video platforms,
Space
absolutely.
seems to be easier to moderate, yeah.
Yeah. So that 1-2 punch essentially means that, you take away the liability of the recommendations, protection of liability and recommendations, and then you take away your liability protections in the content that you have. Makes it very, very difficult to run a platform. So at the end of the day, that means that the Supreme Court, depending on where they go with these things, are going to be handing down a decision where states, such as what we're seeing in Texas and Florida and California, are left to make up the rules that then get decided later on around whether to get rid of Section 230 altogether or continue to narrow it. But it also means that in between this decision happening and Congress making an actual decision on what it wants to do with it, these companies are left in limbo. And no one's crying for big tech on this front, but it does mean that the 99% of platforms that actually aren't big tech will also be impacted by these things. And so it's a perfect storm of two things where, the divided government in Congress means that people will have to work together, which has been historically difficult. And then the impetus behind the Supreme Court handing down this decision means that they need to make a decision faster than not. And I think at the end of the day, the pocketbook question for constituents is whether or not their internet works the way that they've grown to be accustomed to it working. So that's a long window of saying we're coming up to the end of the road very fast, and a decision will prompt that new path pretty soon.
Yeah, so I mean, kind of what you're saying is if Congress doesn't act, which we don't really think they will, legislatively on Section 230, the Supreme Court will probably redefine the law and how it's interpreted, and that could have massive impacts. We see a conservative majority. I mean, any guess of how they'll rule?
It's a conservative majority, and Justice Thomas has wanted to address Section 230 for many years now, and that's probably as much of an insight as I have.
That's fair. That was a cop out, but that's okay. Yeah, no, we don't know. But yes, I do think it'll be worth watching. And you also referred to Texas and Florida's laws that would force platforms to carry speech. It would not allow them to ban viewpoints or to deplatform candidates or politicians, basically referring to what happened to former President Donald Trump on all the major platforms. Those are going up. They're being petitioned to the Supreme Court by well, in Florida's case, both by the Attorney General there and by the tech platforms. But in the Texas case, the Fifth Circuit ruled in favor of the state. So do you think the Supreme Court will take it up since the 11th and 7th, and then the Fifth Circuit ruled differently?
I think folks are generally surprised they took up the two cases they did, and there's a better fit for the split court that happened with Texas and Florida to address some of the issues that Justice Thomas has said that he wanted to address in the past. So I don't know how this, again, I'm not a constitutional lawyer or a lawyer in any shape or form, but I don't know how this decision would impact those decisions, but very much a potential there if there's a split court.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Well, another question, I just want to remind everyone we have a few minutes left. If anyone has any more questions, to submit them, but via YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter. But one we have is asking if Congress will ever work to address mis and disinformation next year. I mean, that does tend to fall under Section 230 and content moderation. We've seen some attempts, basically Democrat-only bills, to peel back Section 230 and hold platforms liable for not just mis and disinfo, but hate speech and extremist content, a lot of different areas. But do you foresee any pathway for mis and disinfo to be legislated on?
Not in the way that I think people are thinking about it in terms of trying to curb it, because I think it just goes right into the censorship. question again. But where I could see particularly a GOP House doing some hearings and stuff on is some of this controversy around some of the efforts that the Biden administration have put into place to try to work with the tech companies and others around these types of issues. And that's been garnering more criticism from the right
or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it's frustrating because this stuff, you know, some of these things like CISA was created underneath the Trump administration. And these companies do still make decisions on their own when stuff is flagged to them, but that doesn't necessarily stop these things from becoming a political football. And so in the area that it's addressed, I think it's more in terms of like actually trying to, from the Republicans, trying to reduce it more. That again could be interesting if we get the Democratic Senate, but I don't foresee much happening in that space at all.
Yeah, and if I can just add on to that real quickly, you know, Jim Jordan is potentially, I believe, going to chair the Homeland Security.
Jim Jordan would probably be Judiciary.
Sorry, apologies. Well, there is, you know, potential there because of what Katie mentioned there. I also think that there's potential around this idea of a select committee on China, where Republicans have mentioned that they want to stand us up. There's questions as to whether that would happen because folks would have to yield some of their authority on China from their current committees to do that. But, you know, there is evidence that, you know, China has these bot farms set up that are used to push mission disinformation. There's definitely an avenue there for that to come up when it comes to looking at China, and in addition to some of the other cybersecurity related issues that would come up with the kind of China focus select committee. And in addition, you know, Russia definitely, I mean, there's a number of different nation states that have these apparatuses set up. We can point to Russia, we can point to China. There's a number of other ones that are all vying to get the attention of Americans. Whether that manifests itself into legislation, potentially not. Whether it becomes a committee focus around, you know, let's say what China is doing around disinformation, potentially yes.
Right. And one other thing we didn't really bring up was TikTok, probably an investigation around TikTok. You first, next Congress in control. Yeah. Well, I think we need to wrap up. This was a very expansive conversation. Thank you all for your time. And, you know, we don't quite know the results still from the election, but it does seem that we'll be looking likely at a Republican-controlled House and then potentially a democratically controlled Senate, so split Congress, probably less legislation next year, but certainly it seems like there'll be interest in investigations into these platforms and into handling of data in China and other foreign countries. So we'll be watching. I assume all of you will be as well. I'll be writing about it for Politico. So thank you guys for the conversation, and thanks BPC for holding this panel.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you.